Warm welcome to our session, Visions and Ways Forward for the Post-Pandemic Future. My name is Sabaheta Ramcilovik-Suominen. I'm an Associate Research Professor and Academy Research Fellow at the Natural Resources Institute, Finland, Bukhi. It is my pleasure to moderate and host this session today. The session is a part of our annual Development Days conference organized by the Finnish Society for Development and Research, of which I am a proud member of the board for some 6 years, I think. So I would like to acknowledge the Society's effort in organizing this online version of the conference today. Henry Onodera and Eva Mäkkinen especially, but also many others. And while we are at the acknowledging, let me also acknowledge and thank Antti Autio and Chris Jango, who are taking care of the technical issues, making sure that everything proceeds smoothly, hopefully, fingers crossed. And finally, thanks to our speakers and all of you in the audience joining us here today for the discussion. Before I proceed with introducing our speakers, I would just like to say a couple of housekeeping details. First, about the schedule. So our panelists will each have 10 minutes to present their ideas. Then I will ask a follow-up question on some specific aspect from their talk. And then we will have question and answer sessions for about 30 minutes. So you can choose, you write your questions in the chat during the talk, and I will then compile them and ask them in the end of the session. Or if you wish to ask in person, please just feel free to unmute your mic and raise your hand perhaps beforehand and ask your question. Please do keep your mics muted during the session, and it would be good if you can keep your videos on, no pressure, but it's good to see faces sometimes. And then just a few words about the theme of today's session as well. So this morning we had a really inspiring roundtable discussion on the pandemics and implications for development research. In this session today, we will bring up some examples, opportunities, as well as challenges for co-creating the new normals and new social truths for a post-pandemic future. I couldn't offer a better perspective of what post-pandemic is than the one I picked up from Jeremy Green and Dora Varka in their contribution to Thinking in a Pandemic project. Thinking in a Pandemic, which is a project, but it's also, it was published as a book, and they write, just as the post-colonial period continued to be shaped by structures established under colonial rule, so too are our post-pandemic futures indelibly shaped by what we do now. There will be no simple return to the way things were. Whatever normal we build, it will be a new one. Like the world of scientific facts after the end of a critical experiment, the world that we find after the end of an epidemic crisis looks in many ways like the world that came before, but with new social truths established. So with that in mind, and without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. So our first panelist is Maria Fernanda Gebara. Maria Fernanda is a social anthropologist who, for the last decade, worked with communities in the Brazilian Amazon. Her research focused on the challenges of changing anthropocentric attitudes from diverse perspectives, investigating local practices, traditional knowledges, policies, networks, and media in order to understand alternative configurations between human and other than human beings. Today, she will talk about rethinking of human-nature relations, indigenous ontologies, and new becomings. Maria Fernanda, the screen is yours. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk in this inspiring session. Thank you for the introduction, Saba. I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, so the main objective of my presentation is to highlight the need to rethink human relationships with the rest of nature and how indigenous ontologies could positively contribute to transitioning from the COVID-19 crisis. I start by questioning who is invading who. Many have argued that the pandemic is nature's revenge. And this is because when we think about the root causes of pandemics, we see that they are mainly related to constant anthropic intervention in natural systems. So when we think about indigenous people's exposures to virus, novel pathogens have disseminated indigenous populations since colonial times. And if we think that areas considered pristine in terms of natural value were in fact sustainably managed by local inhabitants over millennia, we can have a better idea of how indigenous knowledge is actually crucial in transitioning to more sustainable futures. So what are indigenous ontologies? Once indigenous people are immersed in deep experiences with nature, they view and live the world as relational and animate. Humans are actually nature and vice versa, meaning that the whole nature and universe are alive. Indigenous peoples have also deployed what has been called exuberant technologies of enchantment that reinforce connections with places and events and stories. And they perceive themselves as serving these other than human contexts rather than the opposite. Some examples from Amazonian groups include the Kayapó, who believe that their ancestors learned their social skills from insects. For the Bora, plants hold a complex and important knowledge that should be respected. The Ashaninka believe that human beings perceive only the apparent manifestations of material reality. And the Yawanawa in Brazil, they view themselves and nature as part of an extended ecological family. So what does this mean in practice? Nowadays, we have what is called the anthropocentric politics, where the human subject is actually at the center of the juridical order and is the only true agent and beneficiary. In an ecocentric approach, human beings are perceived as an integral part of a much larger whole. But up until now, only Ecuador has rights on nature in its constitution. In Bolivia, there is legal recognition of the rights of Mother Earth. It also recognizes vivir bien, which means living well and in harmony with nature. But in both countries, there are contradictions between such frameworks and the neoliberal logic of development. Unfortunately, in Brazil, there are no attempts to turn away from anthropocentric hierarchies. And although the Constitution recognizes different environmental and indigenous rights, it also entrenches humans as the main beneficiaries of such rights. There are some critiques that raise different questions about the real intentions behind such movement, but still they represent a move to turn away from anthropocentric approaches and to create new ethical obligations towards the other than human world. So thinking about the human nature dualism, we need to start questioning the place of humans at the center of world history, a view that flourished in the Enlightenment, and the assumption that the human prerogative is only reason, to be able to bring about a new emphasis on diversity reflected in the notion of the multiverse or a pluralistic universe. And this refers to the entanglement of several ontologies and agency distribution. And it seems that the indigenous wisdom could guide us towards these new possibilities and how to interact with what is strangely invisible, but certainly necessary if we want to rethink and shape our standards of behavior. But of course, there is a risk that the adoption of the beyond human nature duality and the decolonizing discourses by scholarship, private and public actors may turn such approaches into metaphors. And this means that they can further colonialism and in an attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity. It's like the settler holds a better position to understand indigenous knowledge, to make the best use of it. So different than the old settler that would dominate the land directly, the new settler, to use Tuck and Young words, is making a new home rooted in a homesteading worldview where the wild land and the wild people were made for his benefit. So it's really important to keep in mind that decolonization is not accountable to settler futurity. It should be accountable to indigenous sovereignty in the first place. And we should also be able to better include the contributions of indigenous intellectuals and activists to theories and frameworks. Because now there is little recognition, given that these discussions often take place in spaces that are restricted to non-indigenous intellectuals. And finally, accept that the answers will probably not come from friendly understanding, and a conflicting scenario may emerge, but we should think of conflicts as well as constructive and not something to be avoided. So it's important to reimagine political systems in transitioning from the COVID crisis, and the concepts of cosmopolitics may be a good start, as it includes different parts of the cosmos as beings of rights. And this is something that is already being reflected in an emergent indigeneity in governance that is happening in different parts of the world. And it's already being discussed in global arenas, such as the United Nations. And we do not need to go too far into the forest as well to find more about such ideas. There are many other examples of traditions and studies that are trying to reanimate the landscape. Paganism is a great example, and many would actually argue that the ecological problem dates back to overcoming paganism with monotheism. There is also panpsychism, cosmopsychism, and quantum mechanics that affirm that everything down to the level of quantum has conscious, and a growing body of research on the intelligence and teachings of other than human beings, such as plants. And what I'm trying to say is that these are philosophical and scientific questions that are more and more reaching over modern science. And we could use this work to start tearing down the ontologies that are defended by indigenous peoples for centuries, changing this hegemonic view that all that there is here to serve us. But IP elders sadly are dying, and the youth are also losing interest on ancient knowledge, and differently than in Western culture, there are no books. But in a more hopeful side of the equation, there are different initiatives already happening. They're very inspiring. But going back to the question of nature's revenge, well, if we think that bacteria, which are a type of pathogen, was the first life on Earth, maybe we would have another perception of things, and we would better acknowledge the power of other beings over us, and recognize that we are just traces in the history of Earth. So I don't really think it's a revenge, but an opportunity to rethink our relationship with the rest of nature. So to conclude, there is an urgent need for a conceptual, educational, institutional, and entrepreneurial revolution. And it seems that nowadays, nature is unavoidably political, and this is the main reason why it is important to ask ourselves who defines nature and for what purposes and in whose interests. So I'll leave you with these images of the flat earth and the French Revolution as reminders that our current beliefs and what is in fashion in science may not be necessarily true. It took centuries for scientists to prove that the earth is not flat, but it took just 3 years of revolution to change centuries of absolutism. So I think this is, we should keep that in mind when thinking about transitioning. And finally, for Indigenous peoples, what we are going through now is a necessary passage. And these passages are normally tough, but I hope we will come out of it as a more mature species. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Faye. Wow, that was really excellent. And while I had some questions in mind, I think you did touch upon them, but I will still ask if you can elaborate a little bit more on them. So I was thinking of one of the points is this risk, which you mentioned, risks of popularizing indigenous practices, ways, knowledges, and values, and both. I mean, in policies, you mentioned we can see the nature duality, nature-human duality already being brought up in some of the, not yet in the policies, but at least in the organizations like, let's say, FAO or some of the other UN bodies, but also in academia. And you did mention the metaphor, the coloniality risking becoming just another metaphor and so on. But can you elaborate more a little bit? For instance, I've been thinking myself about the risks for neo-colonial appropriation of indigenous ideas and knowledges. And while it might sound as a joke, I'm thinking about all the consulting groups in 5-10 years sooner offering beyond human nature duality trainings. It's still, we are really, like, as a culture, we are just very good at commodifying everything and everyone. Also, blueprintism, how we as a, maybe that's something you could as well want to reflect a bit more, how we as scientists can support the cause of making, of kind of this co-opting risk or blueprintism, kind of tackling that. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think our whole should concentrate more probably in giving them more voice and letting them speak for themselves as well. I think there is a tendency to speak for them, and sort of as scholars we feel that we go there and we study their knowledge and their practices and other things coming from them, and it's almost like they become an object of our study, and we are already sort of like appropriating in this sort of of acting, and it's very difficult. I mean, I'm telling for myself as well, and I'm an anthropologist, and there has been a lot of critiques in anthropology about it, how to change the way we do things and everything. And sometimes I keep thinking that we are studying the wrong people. We should be pay more attention to ourselves, to the ones that are really responsible for the crisis we are in, and we should become the subjects of our studies and not them. Of course, we need to learn from them and everything to try to change the reality. But yeah, I think there are few studies that concentrate on what we've been doing and why we've been acting like this and so on. So I think this is something that we should try to incorporate more, and again, to give them more voice and to include them more in these discussions. And nowadays they are very globalized. You know, there are many of indigenous intellectuals that are professors, and they are speaking, and one of them could be here, for example, you know, and they are connected to internet and so on. So I think these are good starting steps to sort of like step out of this zone where we have the monopoly of knowledge. You know?
Yeah, that's very well said. It's a really good point. I made a note actually when I'm often myself cannot. I have these puzzles and dilemmas, and this is one good point to keep in mind. Thank you. Okay, so we will now go to the second speaker. Second, yes, Mari Menton. Mari is a research fellow in environmental justice with the Sussex Sustainability Research Program. Her research explores atmospheres of violence and the intersections of multidimensional violence and injustices surrounding development. She is a member of the core team of Not One More, which is a collective that supports at-risk environmental and land defenders. Her co-edited book, Environmental Defenders, Deadly Struggles for Life and Territory, was published just, I think, a week or so ago. So congratulations on that, Mari. And today she will talk about just transformations and intersectional decolonial environmental justice. Mari, I give it over to you.
Okay, great. Just trying to share my screen. There we go. Thank you, Sala, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This day and this discussion, a really important time as we look to what's next and where do we go from here. I am going to go run quickly because, you know, these things we could talk for hours and days and decades, but trying to think a little bit about what just transformations look like, but perhaps more importantly, who decides what they look like and what happens when the powerful elites disagree with different visions of what development or undevelopment or alternatives to development can, could, and should look like. And it, as Faye was speaking, it comes back to me that I keep harping on this quite a lot, that it's not about a voice to the voiceless, it's about making other people listen. You know, they have been shouting for centuries and generations about what their rights should be and what they need and where we should be going, and we're just not listening. And how do we find new ways to get new people at the table to make those decisions and make sure that we're making decisions that are respectful of other people's desires and needs. But this is also a development day, so I'm going to ground some of my discussion and talk about in the Sustainable Development Goals that in theory, you know, look to meet the needs of present generations without compromising the future generations, and this language behind the SDGs of leave no one behind. But the question is are we going where they want to go, and you know, where is this path and who decides what that path should look like? Maybe they don't want to come with us, and I think that and who are we? And so I think all of these questions are really central to making decisions going forward. So Saba asked that I speak a little bit to the concepts around what I'm speaking about. And so part of this is also just to think through what are we talking about when we talk about transformation and just sustainability. Sorry, there's I don't know. Can I only see my screen? Is that possible? There we go. Sorry. Transformative sustainability, or what we call just sustainability, implies a shift that in turn requires that sustainability takes on a redistributive function. And I think that is at the heart of a lot of what is being discussed in spaces around decolonial environmental justice, in spaces around thinking about doing development differently. It's about redistribution. And it's also about thinking about justice and equity as needing to be center stage in the discussions as we move forward. And that we have to address the elephant in the room. You know, if you look at the SDGs, we've got SDG number 8 that looks to sustain per capita economic growth. And I can't go into what degrowth is and what it should be and what it could be in 10 minutes or less. But just to point that we need to really be aware that if we focus on including economic growth in our visions of sustainability, we really do run the risk that, you know, we speak to decoupling of growth and economic and environmental degradation, but there's no sign that that's happening, and it hasn't happened yet. And how do we get there? It seems unlikely. I'm quite skeptical of the technological fix explanations for how we're going to get out of this hole, and that we really do need to think about finding ways to degrow, but in a way that respects and meets the needs of populations in the global south and other marginalized communities that do not have access to the resources that so many of us that are sitting in this virtual room probably do. So one of the things that I've been working on with colleagues is thinking about how do we bring environmental justice frameworks into the sustainable development debate, and how do we move beyond kind of the more traditional understandings of environmental justice as being about distribution, procedure, and recognition, the kind of what Schlossberg and many of the other environmental justice folks focus on, those kind of 3 main things, but really moving beyond that to thinking about environmental justice from a critical lens, from an decolonial lens, also thinking about environmental justice, not just for humans, but for non-humans as well. What does ecological justice look like? And how do we address all the intersections between the different types of injustice? So one of the things that I argue for is that we need to be taking a decolonial approach. And as Faye mentioned in what she was saying, you know, we need to move beyond it just being a metaphor and a thing that we say. We need to make sure that if we have a decolonial workshop, it's not being led by people who don't bring anyone else to the table. You know, it needs to be outside of the global north. It needs to be bringing different voices to the table, and we need to be thinking about, you know, working towards a vision of human life is not dependent upon or structured by the forced imposition of one ideal of society over those that differ. And it's not, you know, it's about taking on board Indigenous ontologies, but also other people, non-Indigenous people's visions of what we need to do. And this then brings in a lot of thinking about abolitionist thinking, decolonial thinking. How can we abolish the same racial and capitalist relationships of power that produce the colonial project of plunder and dispossession? How can we really work on environmental justice if we don't address these disparities? And I argue we can't. We have to think about this, and we have to bring these into the fold. And it's not just about sort of the more traditional might be that wrong word, but the more mainstream versions of environmental justice that think about participation, about distribution of costs and benefits. We also need to think about self-governing authority, that we need to go beyond just distribution, and we need to be breaking down the dualism between humans and nature, and thinking about epistemic justice and self-affirmation. And what do we mean by that? It's who decides what justice is, and different versions of justice exist and need to be taken into account and respected, and need to be part of the decision-making process. And others, Malin and Ryder, have argued for the need to think about environmental justice from an intersectional perspective, that we need to address the fact that different types of justice different injustices are intersectional in nature, you experience injustices based on the very many different complex factors of who you are, where you exist in the world, and what different biases and marginalizations you have suffered. And so we need to think about this from multiple social locations, intergroup differences, multi-scalar lenses, and really think about the questions of power. And I think a lot of this work keeps coming back to questions of power, and that environmental justice more traditionally has not necessarily focused enough on the questions of power and who decides and who has power, whereas political ecology has. How do we take these two kind of schools of thought that are in many ways the same people, but sometimes they're not? How do we bridge that gap and have that discussion? But I think I still have a couple of minutes to think about what happens, though, for the people who are fighting against these dominant paradigms of what development should look like, and what happens when injustices lead to killings, and what do we do about, and this is touching on the other work that I've been doing about these different actors of violence and these different forms of violations of people's rights, their bodies, their territories, their livelihoods, and their actual lives that come about when we see dominant versions of development winning time and time again. The people who stand up against those and stand up to protect the environment, and stand up to protect their lands, and stand up to protect their forests and the waters, they are often criminalized, threatened, intimidated, and in the worst case scenarios, killed. And so we really, when we think about, when I speak to intersectional, decolonial, environmental justice, it's about listening to these voices and bringing these voices to the table. And when we develop new paradigms of development, are they actually addressing the needs and desires and imaginaries of these people? And one recent project to maybe give a little bit of hope, I think, as we look at the pandemic, we have been working with Indigenous students in the northeast of Brazil to map rights violations across their territories, and also some communities in Pará. Thinking about it, we have constellations of conflict, and I think Faye also mentioned this, conflict can be a good thing. Sometimes good things emerge from conflict, and the resistance movements that have emerged both before the pandemic and now more recently during the pandemic in Brazil have been very powerful, and a lot of communities have rallied around the pandemic as a way to protect themselves, to protect their rights, to protect their visions of what their lives should look like. And I just want to end with, again, going back to this, where are we going, and does everybody want to come with us? And this question of leave no one behind during the pandemic, well, as we all know, a lot of people are being left behind. A lot of people are fleeing. The photos on the right is in Peru. People were fleeing Lima on foot to return to their rural communities. Where are we going? Where are they going? Where do we want to go? And how do we bring all these different voices to the table? And how do we use the pandemic as a moment of reflection so that we don't just build back better and repeat the neoliberal dynamics that we have a tendency to build back into the system, even when we face crises. Thank you, and keep those.
Excellent. Thank you, Mari. You picked Finnish so fast.
Did I?
Yeah, because you already use Finnish. That's amazing. We just had a few meetings so far. Thanks so much for really insightful findings and thoughts and ideas. I would like to ask about the things you talked, the colonial environmental justice, but also sustainable degrowth. I mean, given that these two concepts especially are based really on ideas, notions that argue for a deconstruction of the current socioeconomic and political structures. So everything from modes and principles, especially of consumption, production, trade, the arguments about distribution of wealth and power, and just thinking the reality where we still think in terms of global competitiveness, and not just still. I mean, that's still the rule of the game. But okay, then also the other part of this ideas of those concepts is that the need to decolonize the epistemologies and ontologies, which essentially means giving up our cultural, philosophical, cognitive domination that has been there for a century or so. So can we genuinely hope or think that insights from such radical calls for change can ever really take off in the Western capitalist structures, practices, and policies? But I mean, without being, modified and molded to something else, like what we have seen with the sustainable development happening and so on. And where does one start from? Just if you can. It's like two different balls. Sorry, I'll mute myself.
I think there's a few things I can say to that. I don't think we're gonna. Well, I would like to think that we could change the system overnight, but I don't think that that's going to happen. It would require a revolution. It would require the powerful players to lose power, and they're going to hang on to that for as long as they possibly can. And so when I see a lot of hope, the hope that I have for change is the grassroots social movements and the kind of power in numbers of so many voices now shouting for the same thing, and shouting so loud that the ones at the top of the pyramid they may not be listening in the way that I would like them to listen, but I do think they at least hear it. And I think that that's what I see as the potential for it's like a glacier, and we're trying to push on it, and it's ever so slightly shifting in the direction that we want it to. I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to change in the next couple of years, right? But I think that if we keep on pushing, there are signs of change. There are signs that the UN is now speaking about the rights for a safe and healthy environment. There's attention to Indigenous people's rights, much more than there would have been a decade ago. And so, is it fast enough? No, but at least, if enough voices are there pushing in the right direction, I do see change, and I do see a change in the language of international policy spaces, and that they are paying more attention. And maybe the pandemic in its own, obviously it has brought disaster in its own way, but it has also created more online spaces that do allow for new voices to be included. That, when you had to fly somebody somewhere to be at a conference, you didn't invite people from the global south, or yes, a lot of people didn't, because they had that excuse. There is no longer an excuse. All they need is an internet connection. And so I think there's a lot of potential there to push the shift faster, and to find the positive examples and really run with them. But I'm not overly optimistic that it's going to happen next year, but it's glacial.
Yeah, but I can definitely echo that. I also often think of this grassroots small changes at home, at the local level, and pushing for the larger ones, and without getting tired, even though it can be tiring.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So you're doing really well with time, and let's go and have our third speaker the possibility to present his ideas. Mathew, Bukhi, Mabele. Mathew is a conservation social scientist working at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Dodoma in Tanzania. So he's applying a more critical political ecology lens and explores the politics over framings and concepts such as conservation, anthropocene, environmental degradation. He looks at the implications for the day-to-day resource governance and social justice in the Miombo woodlands and other similar ecosystems in Tanzania. Mathew's talk will focus on conviviality in the context of post-COVID and post-growth conservation. Mathew, I will give the screen over to you. And we'll mute.
Thanks, Saba. So now my screen. Yeah. So thanks once again, Saba, for the invitation, and thanks to Mary and Maria for great presentations, which I think my talk is mostly going to build on some of the ideas that I presented. And so basically my talk reflects on one radical ideas for a post-capitalist and transformative environmental conservation approach, which is going by the name convivial conservation. So for this talk, I'm also going to reflect on one of the possible alternative funding schemes for such a conservation approach, which we call community-based conservation insurance. So this idea of convivial conservation was formulated and brought up by Bram Bush and Robert Fletcher in their first in their article and then in their book last year. So they define convivial conservation as sort of as a vision, a politics and set of governance principles that propose a post-capitalist approach to conservation that builds on politics of equity, structural change, and environmental justice. So you can see some of the ideas that I'm going to discuss basically reflect on what Mary and Maria talked about. So for them, they argue that convivial conservation comes from the idea of conviviality, which they define as sort of a mechanism for building long-lasting and engaging and open-ended relationships between humans and non-humans and ecologies. So it sort of aligns with one of the very dominant African philosophy, which is called Ubuntu, which is sort of a decolonial option that is available in Southern Africa in terms of trying to go with this decoloniality of knowledge that is surrounding conservation science, policy, and practice. So we have this Ubuntu as sort of an ethic of care for other human beings as well as the physical world. So it's ethic of care for other human beings and non-human beings, including the ecology that we're talking about. And it promotes life through mutual sharing and caring between and among humans and non-humans. So this idea of convivial conservation aligns with some of the discussion that have been going on in Southern Africa about the decoloniality of knowledge and the use of Ubuntu as a possible decolonial option that we can have for socially and ecologically just conservation approaches. So for them, Bram and Robert, they ground the premise of convivial conservation on the fact that conservation is critical to transformation to sustainability. But as the way it is now, most of the practices need to change radically, because most of the dominant conservation practices, actually, they have not been quite successful in terms of addressing the loss of biodiversity, but also we have been experiencing a lot of reduced conservation funding, and also some of the plans for addressing biodiversity loss, such as the half-earth proposal, but also the 30 by 30 proposal, are actually problematic because they pretty much incite and compound social and livelihood costs that have, most of people in the South and people in Southern Africa in particular have experienced because of these conservation approaches. So convivial conservation differs, in some in most of the ways with other existing sort of coexistent and cohabitation practices, such as one that we have in Tanzania through the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, where we have the Maasai living with the wild animals in some ways. But convivial conservation differs because it goes beyond this faith in protected areas, because convivial conservation tries to challenge this philosophy of separating people and nature. So it goes away from the idea of protected areas, but also it goes away from the faith that conservation approaches have had on the market-based instruments, and that's where convivial conservation differs, because it proposes sort of different funding mechanisms. And one of the funding mechanisms that it has proposed is conservation insurance, which is pretty much the focus of this talk. So there have been calls to reform conservation practice, but also to develop alternative funding mechanisms. And these calls have existed because of a number of reasons that one I've just mentioned, the failed mechanism through the market-based instruments, but also there have been sort of increasing government austerity that has happened across many countries in Africa, but in particular in Tanzania, where, for instance, since last year, the government have formulated a new finance law, which requires all revenue that are collected and generated in conservation landscapes. They're supposed to be they are collected by the state treasurer, because in the past these conservation authorities and agencies were collecting their own revenues and spending as per their activities. But now, with the new law, all the money that comes from the protected areas, from the national parks, from game reserves, game controlled areas, all money goes to the state treasury. So this has pretty much affected the availability of funds for the conservation agencies. So that has been one of the reasons to sort of thinking around new alternative conservation funding schemes. But also, and then now with the COVID-19 pandemic, it has actually heightened, the urgency for the call for new alternative conservation funding, because with COVID and its economic consequences, especially in the context of tourism finance, so conservation and protected area in most parts of the South have pretty much been affected, and in particular Tanzania. So all these causes have made the need to rethink about conservation finance an urgent matter. So this is what we are trying to do here in Tanzania through a project which is called Towards Convivial Conservation Governing Human and Wildlife Interactions in the Anthropocene. So this is a project which is implemented in collaboration with 6 different universities in 6 different countries, one being in Tanzania, the other in Finland, US, UK, Netherlands, and Brazil. So we're trying to look on these large predators. In Tanzania, we're looking on the lion and the interaction with humans. In Finland, they're looking on the wolves. In Brazil, they're looking on the jaguars. US on the grizzly bears. So those are the 4 case studies that we are trying to do. So, so when it comes to these alternative conservation fundings, there have been some suggestions that have been made. And one of the suggestions that is circulating in the conservation literature is the so-called conservation basic income that has been suggested by Bram and Rob. And this conservation basic incomes comes from the idea of the universal basic income, which is, I think it has been implemented in Finland, or it was proposed in Finland or something like that. So they proposed this conservation basic income as one of the possible alternative funding mechanism for conservation, for a post-capitalist conservation. But one of the problems with the proposal is that the sources for funding conservation basic income basically comes from external sources. So I think such a mechanism would create a danger of dependence and vulnerability when it comes to external shocks. So for that, and then we have proposed a place-based local sort of mechanism, which we call community-based conservation insurance, as a mechanism which contextually fits ecological and social settings in most countries in Southern Africa, in particular in Tanzania. So for this case, we define conservation, community-based conservation insurance as a voluntary social risk management scheme for subsidizing costs and losses brought by unintended consequences of environmental conservation. So we frame it as a potential instrument of protection from the impoverishing effects of environmental conservation for individuals who are living in or around conservation areas. And so what we are proposing with this is for an insurance schemes that cover for life insurance in case of a loss of life caused by wildlife, but also crop insurance to cover loss due to wildlife invasion and establishment of protected areas, and also livestock insurance to cover risk and loss caused by wildlife depredation, and also household and property insurance to cover damage caused by wildlife invasion, especially in terms of elephants and invasion. And our proposal builds on vast experience that we have had in Africa, especially in the context of the so-called community-based health insurance schemes, where this way it's a local place-based insurance schemes for the health sector. But one of the problems with these existing placed and local place-based insurance schemes in Africa has been in terms of a small risk pool. So what we propose for the community-based conservation insurance schemes is to have a sort of a startup where we select a handful community within a single landscape to start with, because we just want to start with a very fairly small pool where we can pool that has even similar characteristics, so that we can take advantage of the existing community institutions and culture when it comes to issues of conflict resolution, compliance, but also just the general buyout of the scheme. So our proposal also goes with the notion of trying to think about sustainability of the funding scheme, so that for that case, we are thinking about sort of an hybrid system where we have subsidies for targeting vulnerable members of the community, especially women, children, and the elderly population. Because research has shown that young individuals are willing to pay for the premium. So this proposal with the hybrid system is just to target the vulnerable population whom can't pay for the premium. And this, I think, would overcome the problem of the risk, small risk pool that has experienced with other place-based insurance schemes, such as the health insurance scheme that I've just mentioned. But also to overcome the problem of the moral hazard, which has also been experienced with other insurance schemes. So our proposal developed guidelines on how to make payments, how and when to make payments, but also we have procedures for verification of damages and claims, but also procedures in terms of the duration of payments. So all these preconditions and elements, I think, tries to overcome the problem of the moral hazard. But also, one of the other challenges that we have seen in the literature when it comes to similar insurance schemes in Africa, for instance, the livestock insurance scheme, which covers the northern part of Kenya, where they have this livestock insurance scheme to address drought risk. One of the problems that they had was they did not start with capacity building for the potential uptakers. So for the proposal that we have, actually we are starting with the capacity building of the potential uptakers, because we want them to understand the costs and benefits of having such an insurance scheme. And this is a way that to avoid some of the failures that the livestock insurance scheme in Kenya experienced. And collection of premiums, it's going to be from individuals who voluntarily enroll in the insurance scheme, and the designing and the running of the conservation of the community-based conservation insurance scheme is going to be at the local level, and having the communities, local communities, running both administrative and financial autonomies. So that is the thinking that we have behind this community-based conservation insurance scheme as a very much potential alternative funding mechanism to fund a post-capitalist conservation approach. But just to conclude, we are proposing this with the understanding that it cannot completely address the inadequacies in conservation funding, because that is a very complex sort of arena. So we know that this proposal and a scheme cannot completely address the inadequacies that we have experienced in conservation funding. But that does not mean that we should not think about it as a very much potential funding scheme, because of the uncertainties that we have experienced with existing funding mechanisms. So we have this as a scheme that has a potential to work as alternative to the volatile global capitalistic structures that have existed in terms of funding conservation, especially now in the times that we are experiencing a lot of recurring uncertainties in the world. So for us, we take community-based conservation insurance schemes as a very much potential scheme that we can think about. Yeah, so yeah, that's the end of the discussion that I plan to provide.
We can't hear you, Saba.
Yeah, I can't hear you, Saba.
Sorry, now my mic.
Yeah, now I can hear. Yes.
So thank you, Mathew, for sharing your experience and thoughts about conviviality in conservation. Could you reflect on the component on the decoloniality of knowledge? Like in this context of co-creating an alternative place-based conservation practices, how that happens in practice, in the sense how one incorporates those traditional ways, visions, and knowledges, like from the Ubuntu. And also, what does that mean for the role of us scientists? How our role needs to change to allow for a practice of a kind to take place?
Yeah, so in terms of the first part of the question, in terms of the decoloniality of knowledge, I think how this can happen in practice needs some conditions. And one of the conditions, as I just mentioned in about the philosophies behind conservation science and policy and practice in Southern Africa, is pretty much rooted on colonial principles, assumptions, and philosophies. And this philosophy of separating people from nature is a colonial-rooted principle that never existed in most parts of Southern Africa. So changing that needs also to change the thinking behind conservation science, policy, and practice. And one of the best areas to start with is education institutions. So that is one of the suggestions that we have been having here in terms of changing education curricula for wildlife and forest professionals in Tanzania. We have had some of these discussions going on. Actually, we have we have made a proposal to get some funding to initiate such an initiative, because we believe if we are going to change how these professionals think about the human environmental interactions through some of this traditional understanding, which pretty much is ignored in training and is considered to be having little significance in understanding how human relates to nature. So I think that would be a very good starting point in terms of making some of these ideas that I've mentioned in practice. So that would be one of the ways to make that in practice. And in terms of the role of us as scientists, I think we just need to understand and appreciate, also be sort of reflective in terms of how we write and what we publish, but also in terms of the social relevance of what we do. I think that is one of the questions behind, and I think that is the essence of the movement for decoloniality, because it's all about some of the elements within the movements. It's all about trying to make the world better. So it's all about trying to move for social justice and so on. So it needs us as scientists to be reflective of what we publish.
Now, at least I do not hear Mathew anymore. Ante, is everything all right? Do you hear me?
Yes, I do hear you. I think Mathew's connection has some issue.
Okay.
Let's try to fix that. You might meanwhile
Ask questions. Yes. Okay. Great. So at the moment, I'm looking at the chat, and we have 2 questions. And I also invite at the same time the audience to please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or otherwise raise your hand and we will let you speak. But one question to the presenters or to our speakers about the presentations. Would it be okay to share your presentations with me, and then I could share it with the interested audience? If that's okay, yes. That's not so. Over internet, even the smallest question can get very complicated because one has to unmute and say, okay. But I have a question here from Tove Selin, and I think this would be also for Mathew question. What do you think about the 30% protected plan of the scientists, the 30-30? If any. Oh, okay, you're back. Great.
I had a power breakout, so yeah.
No problem. Well, the question that we have in the chat is actually, I think, for you, but of course also Mari and Fernanda can answer as well. So, what do you think about the 30% protected plan of the scientists? The 30-30, which was just a few weeks back approved. I think you know what is the question referring to.
Yeah. So I don't know if you have seen a letter which some of these conservation social scientists have written as a sort of a response to the Cambridge working paper. I think it's a letter that Aruna Grawal, Dan Brockington, and other Rosalind Duffy and other conservation social scientists have responded to this proposal. And I think it's quite appalling in terms of the guts that such scientists would have to propose for such a problematic plan, even without considering and taking into the thinking some of the social and livelihood costs that have been documented for over the last 20 years or 30 plus years about such plans. So it's pretty much a problematic plan because it's going to increase some of these costs that are associated with the notion of protected area. And I think this is one of the elements that convivial conservation is trying to criticize. Because any philosophy that includes separating people from nature pretty much basically is going to have social implications, adverse social consequences, especially in the southern parts of Africa, where we still have people depending on such landscapes for farming, for grazing, for charcoal making, and all sort of livelihood strategies. So if you are going to set aside more lands for protected areas, it means that you are going to affect even more people. And also one of the criticism that was raised in the letter is in terms of the number of people that are going to be affected with such a plan. They have not provided the number of people that are going to be affected with such a plan. So basically, I would just say it's a problematic plan that has no relevance, but also it's pretty much a colonial sort of imposed plan, because even if the number of people that are engaged in creating and developing such a plan, most of them are coming from Europe and North America. So it's pretty much a problematic plan that has no relevance in the context of Southern Africa.
Thanks, Mathew. I saw actually the letter being signed by something like 200 NGOs against the 30-30 goal. We have a question from Tim, goes to Mari. He says, great presentation, Mari, and I agree. Here in Finland, critique of SDGs, for example, growth-based, non-redistributive, and colonial nature of it is rare, even among those working the development field. How is it in UK?
I think that the critical amongst us tend to be often in the minority everywhere. But I think a growing minority and a growing voice saying, can we please step back and think about this a little bit more? And so I don't know what it's like in Finland. I don't know what it's like, but I think it's probably similar. I think most people think, oh, the SDGs sound good. And they were more consultative in their construction than the Millennium Goals. They do make an effort to be a bit more holistic, but in any of these structures, there is going to be problems and there's going to be needs for improvement. And so I think there's always a need for that voice to say, well, wait a bit, what about this? What about that? And there's always going to be those people who are the minority asking those difficult questions. And I think it's a little bit similar, the 30-30 plan, just to answer that question too. I think there's the mainstream that tends to set the agenda, and that often is a bit, it's almost 20, 30 years out of date in terms of where a lot of the thinking has already moved. And then I guess that goes back to that, how does change happen? It's glacial, and it's like, okay, why are we back at a 30-30? Why are we talking about more protected areas when we have, I think in my bubble, we've moved past that. But obviously, our bubbles are not as big as we think they are. And yeah, so it's about these mainstream ideas versus those of us who are, I think, being a more critical voice and asking the slightly more difficult questions. We're always there. We always show up.
There is a reason why there are a few critical questions. From my experience, I was environmental governance. I'm still, I guess, environmental governance researcher, and started this. Many of us start with environmental policy, and you talk about participation. You have all these beliefs, how things has to be, and you're so sure this is the way. But then you meet another reality, and you start reflecting, you start criticizing, and your previous colleagues, and so what is then your solution? It's always this challenge that we have to now find solutions. So if you dare to question something, then you need to have a solution, and so on. But anyhow, I think I could just add a little bit on this discussion, and please, in the meantime, I want to encourage the audience to ask questions. In terms of like what needs to be done, how fast, in order, for us to to cope the ecological crisis, but also the social and the crisis of inequalities and so on. And often before COVID, there was this, the perceptions and the government approach to issues like climate change and other environmental issues, like, well, we cannot be done. This is in the hands of the market, and we cannot do much, and so on. But COVID, in a way, shows that, well, the states are pretty can be pretty authoritarian when they want and decide certain actions and things. So it somewhat indicates that seems like one of the main barriers or reasons for really radical changes are that it is the economic growth, and that it's such a capitalist system that has to rely on more and more, whether we need it or not, whether we need it for our well-being or not. So we are in a way trapped in this thinking that, okay, nothing can change, we are not getting anywhere. But I think just there's some bigger events, and I think Maria Fernanda mentioned the French Revolution, and things like that prove it is possible. So I think we need to remember this momentum, keep the momentum, and pushing for changes, as I think many of us here highlighted. Would you like to comment and reflect on each other's talks, maybe? Because I can see a lot of, we have the coloniality of knowledge, nature, human duality that were very much prominent in Maria Fernanda's talk and Mathew's. And then, Maria, you had a more overarching theoretical approach covering all those things. If you would like to reflect on each other's talk, that would be also, I think, really interesting. Shall I pick names? For instance, it's interesting to see that Maria Fernanda, you're mainly working in the Amazonian, the Brazilian Amazon context, and then we have similar ideas coming from the African continent, the Ubuntu. Perhaps you could would be interesting to hear discussion how the traditional indigenous peoples ideas and principles compare or differ from one another. And I have here, oh no. What do you think, Maria? I'm sure you have a lot of, with your experience working with indigenous peoples. Would you like to open up a little bit more on their everyday practices and how they live their politics of difference, how they manifest it?
Yeah, I think where they relate these traditions is in specific in this link of seeing everything as relational, and it's not that humans are better or at the center, or yeah, like nature is not here to serve us, as I was mentioning in my presentation. So it's more like everything has a spirit, like in the indigenous view, but you could call it other names as well, like consciousness and or intelligence or life, or whatever you want to name it, depending on how you look at it and how you study it. So I think this is what is common in this more traditional cultures, and by traditional, I think I mean like pre-industrial communities and groups, and going back a little bit of to what I said to answer your question in terms of looking at how and why we got here as human beings. I think that's very important to try to understand this path, and how did we get disconnected from nature, and understand the history of it as well. Because then when you get the whole history of how did we get here, it becomes a bit, I think at least, a bit easier to think that we can change it as well. You know, you kind of like understand the process, and you see that for many centuries we were actually more connected to nature. We were much more like wild animals, and our nature is somehow wild, and we disconnected from our true ways of beings. I'm not saying that we need to become wild again and primitive. I think we are already in another stage or level. This is not the solution, but at the same time, it's more about like learning from our mistakes and acknowledging them, so we can really address them properly. And what thinking about like addressing the other presentations, what Mary was saying in terms of we need to be better listeners as well, because it's not just about the voice. And so I think this is very important as well. Why aren't we listening, and why it's taking so long to listen and to change? So these are questions that we should definitely think about.
Yeah, self-reflecting, but I can hear that we are all often talking about these ways to improve, and sometimes we get just too much focused on that and little self-reflection. Mathew, did you want to add something on that? I don't want to talk too much. Moderating.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, but I think when talking in the context of Southern Africa, the Ubuntu philosophy that I mentioned, I think it has quite good potential to offer policy and practice in conservation. I'm basically talking about conservation and conservation, to rethink actions when it comes to governing human environmental interactions, because it is an indigenous philosophy which reinstates, which sort of send us to the basics about how we think about interactions. And this is very important in the context when you're talking about the dismantling and disrupting the colonial structures in conservation knowledge, because such structures have pretty much produced and reproduced substantive social injustices and human rights. So Ubuntu as an indigenous philosophy, it gives us sort of a platform to rethink about the way that we govern, the way that we develop knowledge, the way that we justify knowledge that informs policies and practices in conservation and conservation areas. So, yeah, so I think that is something I can add. And the good thing about Ubuntu, it cuts across most parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's something that has existed in such, in these countries. So it's not something that is imposed, So it's a good starting point when you want to think about how to move away from the coloniality of knowledge in different facets of life, and in particular in conservation. So yeah, that is something that I can just add for now.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking about one of the concepts that in my opinion, cut across a lot of the topics that your three speeches addressed is the degrowth, and the one that comes more from the global north. And even though we didn't address it directly much, but it's a concept that I have been maybe in the last year or two being interested in, and have done some reading to get just completely surprised about how much misconception about this concept there is in public. So first, there is always that critique that, okay, it is the privilege of the richer developed countries to talk about degrowth and reducing growth. And it is a concept that emerged from the global north, when in fact the idea, even though it emerged from there, but the ideas are really based on the philosophies that come from the thinkers in the East, from Eastern wisdom. We have Mahatma Gandhi, who have been, the whole ideas of internal and sufficiency, and not too much material growth and so on, and also a lot of connections with the indigenous movements or ideas, philosophies that there are across the globe, and there is the scholars have in the last couple of 5 years or even more, the scholars of degrowth and decoloniality and environmental justice have published together to show all the connections. But there is something with this concept that I think it's in the name. One point is that it is a lot to do with its name. It's like a curse at the same time, but also I think what it would be the opposite of curse, like a positive thing, that name is really like something that the power pyramid doesn't like, because it just think this is going against the key or the main point here. We need to grow. But it's unfortunately, so that would be perhaps maybe it avoids being co-opted in a way, but it is also lots of people who don't really read more than just name have a lot of misconceptions about it. How does the growth speak to your own research topics? How do you see it, similarities or differences with the concepts, like, let's say, for Mari would be environmental justice, for Fernanda it would be the indigenous cosmologies, and conviviality for Mathew. Could you reflect on that? That would be great. We have about 6 minutes before the session ends, so unless I get any urgent questions, we can conclude with that.
Sorry. I'll have a quick stab at your question. I think I mean, yes, degrowth is I find it really interesting just how controversial it is, because to me it's not, it shouldn't be. In that I mean, there are some degrowthers who really do think we should go back to 100 years ago, but I don't think that most people who argue for degrowth are actually arguing for that. They're arguing about a redistribution of the resources we already have, and we just need to slow down and stop overusing. And I don't think, and I don't see it as, I mean, yes, it's more complicated than that, obviously it is, but at the essence of it, it's about recognizing that we can't just keep using up the Earth's resources as if there's no end in sight. And I think some argue that growth has brought us so many benefits, and the end of inequality, or the end, reducing child mortality, and all of these arguments, but it's not. That's development. That's not growth. And I think that's where we need to. They need to be taken as two separate things, that we can improve the system and we can improve our livelihoods and the quality of our education and our health systems without growing the GDP. That doesn't need to be the goal. And I think that's where, I think for me anyway, that's where I see degrowth as coming in, is that we need to decouple these things, and we need to think about them as separate things, and we can have development without growth. And we can move towards, one of the things from speaking to some Indigenous leaders in northeast of Brazil, it's not, they're saying, I don't want equality, I want respect. I want to be able to live the life that I want to live. And you take me off the land, and they say, as one woman said, we're like worms. If you take us out of the soil, off the land, we die. We just want to be able to be on our land, living the lives that we want to live. We're not looking for equal access necessarily. We just want to be respected. And I think that that's, for me, a lot of the fundamental problems, is that we try to impose our own visions of what people should want and should need onto everybody. And it doesn't work that way. And that's not what people want. I'll stop now.
Thank you. Thanks, Marie. Maria?
Just to add to what Marie was saying is, yeah, there is and going back to the concepts of pluriversality and multiverses, and it's very difficult to establish this sort of like blueprint for equality and for reducing inequalities and so on, and for development as well. So what is something good, and what does development means for us is completely different to what it means to Indigenous or even other traditional communities, I believe. And this sort of like top-down approaches and concepts, and then it goes also back to the epistemology justice as well, like how do we define these things, and who is defining these things, and who has the power to define these things, and to establish this sort of like goals, and where we should go to, and how less privileged people should come with us, and things like that, and this is very sort of like dangerous somehow, because it's very difficult to work with all these diversities at the same time. So how do we open our spaces and open our minds to these different types of development, different types of growth, or of well-being, at least, of what it's to be happy and to be wealth. For me, for example, I think Indigenous people are really wealthy because they have the forest, and they have everything they need from the forest, and from my experience, they are actually the happiest people I've ever met, you know, and I've been always like learning a lot from them, much more than what I learn in universities and in really high level debates, you know. So it's very peculiar, these distinctions as well, you know. So these are things that I keep thinking about, and I think we should all keep thinking about, like, these differences and how to respect them, as Mari was saying.
Thanks so much, Maria Fernanda. Mathew, if you would like shortly just still say a few words, and with that conclude before we close the session. Would you want to add something, Mathew?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe just to add on what Maria was talking about such a dilemma, you know, in terms of because sometimes, you know, we are, even as sort of local-based academics and local-based scientists, sometimes we can also be, you know, we can also do this imposition of ideas on local people. You know, imposition of ideas don't need just to come from external scientists and external academics and practitioners, but also sometimes also come from the locals. But the thing is, sometimes it's a dilemma when you see in terms of you know, the boundary between trying to give voice to the voiceless and trying not to do that in a way that we're imposing something on them. You know, so I think that's the dilemma, especially when you see such the so-called voiceless being affected and quite suffering the consequences of some of the high-level thinking and planning. You know, but and then you, as someone who has been able to see the two sides of the voiceless and the side of those who are engaged in planning. So you can sometimes, you know, be involved in trying to, trying to help these voiceless to move away from such struggles. But then that, according to what Maria was saying, that can also be sort of an imposition, you know. So it's a dilemma that we also face as scholars. I think it's it's a good thing to think, as Maria suggested.
That's a that's a good point. Okay, well, I think I want to thank to our speakers and Antti and Chris working behind the scene, making the discussion possible, and to our audience for their attention and questions. Thank you again, everyone, and take care and stay well. See some of you in the closing session. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.